I didn't know how difficult the next 5 years would become. I didn't know how many nights I would cry myself to sleep, or how many times I would question whether my own family had been right about me. But I also didn't know that the worst night of my life was quietly becoming the beginning of everything that would one day make them stand on my doorstep, asking for the daughter they had thrown away. The next morning, I woke up on Daniel's old gray couch with sunlight pouring through the apartment window and the unfamiliar realization that I no longer had a home. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I noticed my suitcase sitting beside the coffee table, my phone filled with unanswered messages from coworkers asking why I hadn't shown up for breakfast before work like I usually did, and the silence that came from knowing my family hadn't called, not even once. I picked up my phone anyway, hoping to see at least one message from my mother saying, "Come back, let's talk." There was nothing, not a missed call, not a text, not even a single word asking if I was safe. It hurt more than I expected, because deep down I had convinced myself they would cool down overnight. Instead, they acted as though I had disappeared from the world. Daniel walked into the living room carrying 2 mugs of coffee and quietly placed one in front of me. He didn't pressure me to speak. He simply sat beside me until I finally whispered, "They really meant it." He nodded gently before saying something I would remember for years. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us become the ones we have to survive. Those words stayed with me long after that morning ended. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that families eventually found their way back to each other, but every passing day made that hope weaker. The following week was one of the hardest periods of my life. I kept going to work, pretending everything was normal while secretly searching for a room I could afford because I refused to become a burden to Daniel. Every apartment I visited was either too expensive, too unsafe, or already rented. My savings were painfully small because most of my salary for the past 3 years had gone to helping my parents. Looking back now, I realize I had been funding the very people who would later abandon me. At the time, however, all I felt was panic. One evening, I checked my bank account and calculated that I could survive for barely 2 months if I found a cheap place. I sat on a park bench staring at the numbers until my eyes blurred with tears. I had done everything right. I studied hard. I worked honestly. I respected my parents. I sacrificed my own happiness for theirs. Yet somehow I was the one left with nothing. Life felt unfair in a way I couldn't explain. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my phone rang. It was my aunt, the same woman who had watched silently while I was thrown out. My heart actually lifted for a moment. Maybe she wanted to help. Maybe someone in the family finally realized what had happened was wrong. Instead, the first words out of her mouth were, "Your father wants the laptop he bought you for college returned. It belongs to the family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That laptop was 5 years old, scratched, slow and barely functioning, yet somehow they wanted it back. Before I could answer, she added, "And don't forget the gold necklace your grandmother gave you. Your mother says it should stay with the family." My breathing stopped. That necklace wasn't valuable because of money. It was the last gift Grandma ever gave me. She had placed it around my neck on my 21st birthday and whispered, "Whenever you feel alone, remember someone believes in you." The thought of losing it felt like losing her all over again. I calmly told my aunt that the necklace had been Grandma's personal gift to me. She laughed and replied, "Well, you're no longer part of this family. Are you?" Then she hung up. I sat there in complete silence before finally breaking down in the middle of the park. People walked past pretending not to notice. For the first time in my life, I understood that some wounds don't come from strangers. They come from people who know exactly where your heart is because they helped shape it. That night, Daniel found me sitting on the apartment balcony holding Grandma's necklace tightly in my hand. Without saying anything, he brought out a small cardboard box. Inside were documents, brochures, and application forms for professional certification programs. "You've spent years building everyone else's future," he said softly. "Maybe it's time to build your own." I stared at the papers, overwhelmed. Most of the courses required tuition I couldn't afford. Daniel smiled and admitted he had already spoken to one of his former professors who knew about a scholarship program for working professionals. The application deadline was only 3 days away. "You're smarter than you think," he told me. "The only people who never believed it were the ones who benefited from your self-doubt." For the next 72 hours, I barely slept. I wrote essays, updated my RA summary, collected recommendation letters from supervisors, and completed every application with more determination than I had ever felt before. My manager at work, Mrs. Collins, noticed how exhausted I looked and called me into her office. I expected criticism for looking distracted, but instead she handed me an envelope. Inside was a glowing recommendation letter she had written herself. She smiled and said, "I've been waiting for you to believe in yourself." I almost cried in her office. It amazed me that people who weren't related to me could show more faith in my future than my own parents ever had. 2 weeks later, I received the email. I had won the scholarship. My tuition would be fully covered, and I would also receive a monthly allowance for transportation and study materials. I read the email at least 20 times before believing it was real. That evening Daniel brought home a tiny chocolate cake from the grocery store. We celebrated in his little apartment with plastic forks because neither of us owned proper dessert plates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the happiest celebration I had experienced in years because for the first time my success belonged entirely to me. No one could take credit for it. No one could use it against me. Life slowly began changing. I rented a small studio apartment with peeling wallpaper and a leaky kitchen sink, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture came from thrift stores or online marketplace listings. My dining table had scratches across the surface. My couch squeaked whenever someone sat down. The bedroom window refused to close completely during winter. Yet every night, I locked the front door and smiled because nobody could throw me out. Nobody could tell me I didn't belong. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't even beautiful. But it was the first place that truly felt like home. Months passed, and I buried myself in work and studying. Promotions came one after another because I volunteered for difficult projects that everyone else avoided. My confidence grew with every challenge I overcame. I stopped introducing myself as someone who had been abandoned and started seeing myself as someone who had survived. Then, almost exactly 1 year after my family kicked me out, an unfamiliar number flashed across my phone. I answered without thinking. The voice on the other end belonged to my father. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. He didn't even say he missed me. Instead, his very first sentence sent a chill down my spine. "Your brother is in serious trouble, and you need to help fix it." I froze the moment I heard my father's voice. For an entire year I had imagined this conversation countless times. In every version, he apologized. He admitted they had been wrong. He asked if we could start over. But the man speaking on the phone sounded exactly the same as the one who had pointed at the front door and told me to leave. His voice carried no guilt, no hesitation, no warmth. It was simply a demand wrapped in the illusion of family obligation. Before I could say anything, he continued, "Your brother's business failed. The bank is coming after him. They could take everything." I closed my eyes, remembering the documents they had tried to force me to sign. If I had agreed that night, I would have been legally responsible for every dollar of that debt. The realization sent a chill through my entire body. My father kept talking as though none of that mattered. He explained that creditors were calling every day, collection agencies had begun visiting the house, and my brother insisted the entire situation could still be fixed if I agreed to help financially. Not once did he ask how I had survived after being thrown out. Not once did he mention the year of silence between us. To him, I wasn't his daughter. I was simply the backup plan he thought he could still use. I took a deep breath and quietly asked, "Why would you think I'd help after what you did to me?" There was a long pause before he answered with words that made my heart sink. "Because we're family." I actually laughed, not because it was funny but because it was unbelievable. Family. The same word they ignored when they packed my belongings into suitcases. The same word they forgot while watching me leave in the rain. Somehow, it only became important again when they needed something from me. I calmly told him I couldn't help and wished him well before ending the call. My hands shook for several minutes afterward. Even though I knew I had made the right decision, saying no to my own father hurt more than I expected. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I had spent my entire life believing my worth depended on sacrificing myself for other people. Choosing myself felt almost unnatural. That evening, I told Daniel everything. He listened quietly before saying something simple that completely changed the way I viewed the situation. "You didn't abandon your family. They abandoned you. Refusing to rescue people from the consequences of their own choices isn't cruelty. It's boundaries." I repeated those words to myself over and over during the following weeks because my family didn't stop calling. My father phoned nearly every other day. My mother left tearful voicemails saying she couldn't sleep because the family was falling apart. My aunt sent long messages about forgiveness and duty. Even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly appeared in my inbox, telling me that good daughters stand beside their parents no matter what. It amazed me how everyone expected something from me, yet nobody apologized for the way I had been treated. Eventually, I stopped answering altogether. My silence became my peace. While my family struggled with the consequences of their own decisions, my own life quietly continued improving. I completed another professional certification with top scores, earning recognition throughout the company. My manager trusted me with leading a project for one of our biggest clients. I was terrified at first because the contract involved millions of dollars in advertising revenue, but I threw myself into the challenge with everything I had. For 3 months I practically lived in the office, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after sunset. Every presentation had to be perfect, every strategy had to work, every decision carried enormous pressure. There were nights I fell asleep over my laptop and mornings when coffee became my breakfast. Yet somehow, I loved every exhausting minute, because this time my hard work wasn't disappearing into someone else's dream. I was building my own future. The campaign became the most successful project our department had ever completed. The client renewed their contract for another 3 years, and the company's executive board personally congratulated our entire team. During the annual corporate awards ceremony, my name echoed through the ballroom as they announced the Employee Leadership Award. I walked onto the stage with tears filling my eyes because I suddenly remembered another room years earlier where my family had laughed at my ambition and called my career unimportant. Standing beneath those bright lights, holding that crystal trophy in my hands, I realized they had been wrong about me all along. A month later, the company offered me a promotion to Senior Operations Manager, along with a salary that was almost triple what I earned the day I left my parents' house. I accepted immediately. The promotion allowed me to move into a beautiful apartment overlooking the city skyline. It wasn't extravagant, but every corner reflected choices I had made for myself. I bought fresh flowers every Sunday because Grandma loved flowers. I framed my university graduation photo since nobody in my family had displayed it. I hung paintings that made me smile instead of decorating according to someone else's taste. Slowly, apartment by apartment, memory by memory, I rebuilt a version of myself that no longer depended on my family's approval. Then life surprised me again. Daniel proposed during a quiet weekend picnic beside a lake. There were no photographers hiding behind trees, no expensive orchestra, no dramatic audience. He simply took my hands, looked into my eyes, and said, "You've spent your whole life wondering whether you're enough for other people. I just want to spend my life reminding you that you always were." I cried before he even finished asking. Of course I said yes. Planning our wedding should have been one of the happiest times of my life, yet one decision haunted me constantly. Should I invite my family? Part of me still hoped reconciliation was possible. Another part remembered every cruel word they had spoken. After weeks of thinking, I decided to send invitations anyway, not because they deserved one, but because I wanted to know I had chosen kindness even if they hadn't. The invitations were mailed exactly 3 months before the ceremony. I waited every day for a response. None came. On the morning of my wedding, I kept glancing toward the entrance of the venue, wondering whether my parents would surprise me. Every guest arrived except them. Every chair was filled except the 3 seats reserved for my mother, father, and brother. The ceremony was beautiful despite the empty spaces. Daniel's parents embraced me as if I had always been their daughter. His mother adjusted my veil before I walked down the aisle and whispered, "From today onward, you never have to wonder where you belong." Those words healed something inside me that had been broken for years. After the wedding, I finally accepted the truth. My family had made their choice, and I could no longer spend my future waiting for people who refused to be part of it. I focused completely on my marriage, my career, and the peaceful life Daniel and I were building together. Another 3 years passed almost unbelievably fast. My position within the company continued growing until I was promoted again. This time to regional director overseeing multiple offices across the country. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the pride I felt every morning walking into headquarters. One Monday, my assistant knocked on my office door looking unusually nervous. "There's, a walk-in applicant here asking for an interview," she said. Normally security would have turned him away, but he insists he knows someone in upper management. I smiled politely and told her to send him to human resources like everyone else. She hesitated before quietly adding one sentence that made the air leave my lungs. "His last name is the same as yours." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. My assistant repeated the last name, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. 5 years had passed since I had walked away from my parents' house with 2 suitcases and a heart full of pain. In all that time, I had built a life I was proud of. I had become someone the younger version of myself could never have imagined. I was no longer the frightened girl desperate for her family's approval. I was the regional director of one of the fastest growing marketing firms in the country, responsible for hundreds of employees and several major offices. My calendar was packed with executive meetings, expansion plans, and million-dollar client negotiations. Yet hearing that familiar last name instantly pulled me back to the rainy evening, when my father had told me I was no longer part of the family. I slowly stood from my desk and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. My reflection stared back at me, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a company badge hanging around my neck. I barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked confident, calm, successful. But somewhere behind those steady eyes still lived the daughter who had once believed she wasn't enough. My assistant asked if I wanted security to escort the visitor out. I thought about it for several seconds before shaking my head. "No," I replied quietly. "Let's follow company policy. If he's applying for a position, human resources can conduct the interview." I had no intention of involving myself. Personal history had no place inside my office. Professionalism came first. About an hour later, the human resources manager, Mr. Harris, requested a brief meeting. He entered carrying a thin application folder and looked unusually confused. "This candidate claims he has a family connection to someone in senior leadership," he explained. "He refuses to say who, only that the person will recognize him immediately." I asked to see the application. The moment I opened the folder, my breath caught in my throat. There it was. My brother's name. His photograph was clipped neatly to the top page. I almost didn't recognize him. The confident young man who used to mock me had disappeared. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a faded shirt and worn jacket. The arrogance that had once filled his smile had been replaced by exhaustion. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and the confidence I remembered had been replaced by desperation. I quietly closed the folder and handed it back to Mr. Harris. "Evaluate him like every other applicant," I said. "Ignore whatever family connection he's referring to." Mr. Harris nodded and left without asking another question. I remained seated for several minutes, staring at the closed office door. I wasn't angry. Surprisingly, I wasn't even satisfied. I simply felt empty. Life had already delivered consequences far greater than anything I could have planned. Later that afternoon, my assistant informed me that Human Resources had rejected my brother's application. He lacked the qualifications required for the management role he had applied for, and there were several inconsistencies in his employment history. Company policy was clear. The decision had nothing to do with me. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, my assistant called my extension once more. "Ma'am," she said nervously, "there are 3 people waiting for you in the reception area. They refused to leave." My stomach tightened before she even said their names. I already knew. I took a slow breath, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the executive lobby. Every step echoed through the polished hallway. Employees glanced up from their desks as I passed, greeting me with respectful smiles. None of them knew the storm waiting downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and I immediately saw them. My father looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely gray, and his shoulders were no longer straight with pride. My mother appeared thinner, her eyes tired and filled with worry. My brother sat quietly in one of the waiting chairs, avoiding eye contact altogether. For several seconds, none of us spoke. 5 years of silence stood between us. Finally, my mother stepped forward with tears already streaming down her face. "Emily," she whispered, saying my name for the first time in half a decade. I remained where I was, calm, professional, respectful, but distant. She reached out as though she wanted to hug me, then slowly lowered her arms when she realized I wasn't moving. My father cleared his throat awkwardly. "You've done well for yourself," he muttered while looking around the impressive reception area with obvious disbelief. I thanked him politely, nothing more. The silence returned until my brother finally stood. He couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't know you worked here, he admitted quietly. When they told me the regional director had the same last name, I thought it couldn't possibly be you. I looked at him for a long moment before answering honestly. 5 years ago. He lowered his head. My father suddenly took a step forward. We need your help, he said. There it was. Not, we're sorry. Not, how have you been? Not, we missed you. Just like every previous conversation, it began with what they wanted. I asked them to explain. My father admitted the business investment had completely collapsed shortly after I left home. The debt had become overwhelming. Their house had been sold to repay part of what they owed. My brother's marriage had ended because of financial stress. My father's health had deteriorated, making it impossible for him to continue working full-time. My mother had taken temporary jobs wherever she could find them, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, they had been forced to move into a tiny rented apartment. My brother had spent months searching unsuccessfully for stable employment. Every sentence painted a picture of a family that had slowly lost everything. When he finished speaking, my mother looked at me with pleading eyes. We don't know where else to go, she whispered. Please, help us. I listened without interrupting. Years earlier, I would have immediately offered every dollar I had. I would have sacrificed my savings, my future, even my happiness just to see them smile again. But that woman no longer existed. I had learned the difference between kindness and allowing people to keep hurting you. I folded my hands calmly and asked one simple question. Before we talk about help, is there anything you'd like to say to me? They looked at each other. My father stared at the floor. My brother rubbed his hands together nervously. Finally, my mother began crying harder than before. We're sorry, she whispered. We're so sorry. It was the apology I had imagined hearing hundreds of times. Yet strangely, it didn't erase the pain. Some wounds heal, but they leave scars forever. My brother stepped forward next. His voice cracked as he spoke. I blamed you for everything because it was easier than admitting I had failed. I laughed when Dad threw you out. I called you selfish. I even insulted Grandma because I wanted to hurt you. I've regretted that every single day. My father remained silent the longest. Eventually, he looked directly into my eyes for the first time. I failed you, he admitted quietly. Not because I lost money, but because I forgot how to be your father. The lobby became completely silent. Employees respectfully looked away, pretending not to notice the emotional conversation unfolding only a few feet away. I took a deep breath before answering. I accept your apology, I said softly. 3 relieved expressions appeared almost instantly. Then I continued. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Their faces changed again. Confusion replaced relief. They had expected everything to return to normal. They still didn't understand that the daughter they abandoned had grown into a woman who finally knew her own worth. And the decision I was about to make would determine whether we would ever truly become a family again. The 3 of them stood in the company lobby without saying a word. My father's eyes searched my face as though he were trying to predict what I would do next. My mother clutched her purse with trembling hands, and my brother stared at the polished floor, unable to look at me. 5 years earlier, I had been the one standing in silence, terrified of what my family would decide. Now, life had reversed our positions. For the first time, I held the power, but as I looked at them, I realized something important. Revenge had once seemed like the only ending that could satisfy the pain they caused me. I had imagined telling them no. I had imagined walking away the way they had walked away from me. I had imagined making them feel the same loneliness I experienced that rainy night. Yet standing there, none of those fantasies brought me peace. Pain has a strange way of changing shape over time. If you carry it long enough, it stops feeling like a weapon and starts feeling like a weight. I was tired of carrying it. That didn't mean I would forget what happened. It didn't mean trust could magically return. But I also refused to let the worst chapter of my life become the author of the rest of my story. I looked at my parents and quietly said, "Come with me." My assistant reserved one of the executive conference rooms, and the 4 of us sat around a long wooden table where I normally discussed business strategies with company executives. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years ago, my opinions had been ignored at my own family dinner table. Now the same people were waiting for me to speak inside a boardroom. I folded my hands and looked at each of them before saying, "I'm willing to help, but not the way you expect." My father's shoulders relaxed slightly, but I raised my hand before he could interrupt. Listen carefully, because this is the only offer I will ever make. They nodded silently. First, I will not give anyone money. I spent years sacrificing my future because I believed solving everyone else's problems would make them love me. I won't repeat that mistake. My brother looked disappointed, but I continued before anyone could argue. Second, I will help you become independent again. Dad, I'll arrange medical consultations through the company's employee assistance network so you can receive proper treatment and career counseling suited to your health. Mom, one of our partner organizations offers job placement and professional training for adults returning to the workforce. I'll introduce you, but you'll have to earn the position yourself. As for you, I turned toward my brother. If you're serious about changing, I'll recommend a vocational training program, not a management job. Not because I want to punish you, but because leadership isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. My brother lowered his eyes and quietly nodded. I'll do it, he whispered. Whatever it takes. I believed him, not because of his words, but because for the first time in his life, they were spoken without entitlement. My father slowly leaned forward. You're helping us after everything we did, he asked in disbelief. I smiled sadly. I'm helping because of the woman Grandma wanted me to become, not because of the people you were. The room fell silent. My mother burst into tears again, but these tears were different. They weren't tears of fear. They were tears of regret. She reached into her handbag and carefully placed a small envelope in front of me. I've carried this for years, she said. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was addressed to me in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. My heart nearly stopped. How? I whispered. My mother wiped her eyes. Your grandmother gave it to me before she passed away. She told me to give it to you when you were ready to hear it. I kept waiting for the right time. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. The ink had faded slightly, but I immediately recognized Grandma's elegant handwriting. The letter read, My precious girl, if you're reading this, then life has probably become harder than I wished for you. I may not be there to protect you anymore, but I need you to remember something. Never measure your worth by the people who fail to recognize it. Diamonds remain valuable even when surrounded by those who mistake them for ordinary stones. One day, the people who overlooked your heart will finally see its value. When that day comes, don't become like them. Strength without kindness becomes pride. Kindness without strength becomes weakness. Carry both, and no one will ever truly defeat you. I have always been proud to call you my granddaughter. Love, Grandma. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred every word on the page. For years I had wondered whether Grandma would have defended me if she had been alive. Now I finally had my answer. She always believed in me, she always would. A few months later, my father began physical therapy and eventually found part-time work mentoring young apprentices at a local workshop. My mother completed her training program and accepted an administrative position at a nonprofit organization. Watching her regain confidence reminded me of the woman she might have become if fear and favoritism hadn't consumed our family years earlier. My brother worked harder than I had ever seen him work. He completed his vocational certification with excellent results and found an entry-level position in a logistics company. He never asked me for another favor. Instead, every holiday he quietly sent me a message saying, "Thank you for giving me the chance to earn my own future." That meant more than any apology ever could. Trust returned slowly, almost painfully slowly. We didn't suddenly become the perfect family. Some conversations remained awkward. Some memories still hurt. There were birthdays we spent apart and holidays where silence lingered between sentences. Healing wasn't a straight line. But little by little, honesty replaced pretending. Accountability replaced excuses. Respect replaced entitlement. Daniel often reminded me that reconciliation isn't about pretending the past never happened. It's about deciding the past doesn't get to control tomorrow. A year later, he and I welcomed our first daughter into the world. When I held her in my arms for the first time, I silently promised she would never have to earn my love. She would never question whether she belonged. She would never stand outside her own home wondering why her family chose someone else over her. One afternoon, when she was almost 2 years old, someone knocked on our front door. I opened it to find my parents standing there, each holding a small wrapped gift. Behind them stood my brother with a shy smile. My little daughter peeked around my leg, curious about the visitors. My father looked at me and quietly asked, "May we come in?" For just a second, I was transported back to that rainy evening years ago when another door had closed in my face. But this house was different. This house had been built on respect, honesty, forgiveness, and hard-earned peace. I smiled, stepped aside, and answered, "You may come in." They entered slowly, looking around at the warm home Daniel and I had built together. Family photos covered the walls. Laughter echoed from the kitchen where cookies were cooling on the counter. Sunlight streamed through the windows, filling every room with warmth. It wasn't the biggest house in the neighborhood. It wasn't the most expensive. But it was filled with something the house I grew up in had never truly possessed: love without conditions. As my daughter ran into her grandfather's arms and my mother wiped away quiet tears, I looked toward the necklace Grandma had once given me, hanging safely in its place near the family photographs. Her words echoed softly in my heart. "Carry both strength and kindness." I finally understood what she meant. Success wasn't becoming richer than the people who hurt me. Success wasn't making them suffer the way I had suffered. Success was building a life so full of peace that the pain no longer had room to live there. The family that once forced me out eventually knocked on my door, believing they were asking for help. They never realized that what they were truly asking for was a second chance. And the greatest victory of my life wasn't that I had the power to refuse them. It was that I had become strong enough to choose wisdom over revenge, boundaries over bitterness, and love that never again required me to lose myself. The door that once closed behind me became the very door I opened for a better future. Not because the past deserved it, but because I did.